I never believed in ghost stories, especially the ones people in Recife told about the old church on Rua das Correntes, a narrow street that barely saw sunlight during the day and turned into a pitch-black corridor at night. The building had been sealed for decades, with thick wooden doors held shut by rusted chains and a heavy iron padlock, and a faded sign nailed to the wall that read, "Entrance forbidden, danger." Locals claimed that at midnight, soft singing could be heard from inside, followed by the sound of footsteps, as if someone, or something, were walking slowly along the old stone floor. My friends knew I wasn't the type to back down from a challenge, so when they dared me to spend one night inside the forbidden church, I laughed it off at first, thinking it was just another urban legend. But that night, we met at the small square a block away from the church, and the air already felt heavier, as if the street itself knew what we were about to do. One of my friends, Paulo, handed me a crowbar and grinned nervously. "You'll need this," he said. The others stood a few meters back, keeping their distance, almost as if they didn't want to get too close. As I approached the church, I could see the intricate carvings on the doors, worn down by time but still beautiful, depicting saints whose faces seemed almost sad. The chains rattled slightly in the wind, and for a brief moment, I thought I heard a faint hum, like someone singing a hymn far away. I shook it off and pried at the padlock until it gave way with a metallic snap, the sound echoing through the empty street. The heavy doors creaked open, releasing a wave of musty air that smelled of damp stone, dust, and something faintly metallic, like old blood. I stepped inside, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, revealing long wooden pews covered in thick layers of dust and cobwebs, hanging like curtains from the ceiling beams. The stained glass windows were so dirty they barely let any moonlight through, casting faint, distorted colors on the cracked floor. I told myself it was just an abandoned building, nothing more, but my heart was already racing, every sound amplified, the crunch of debris under my boots, the faint drip of water from somewhere in the shadows, the soft groan of the wooden structure settling after years of silence. I walked further in, the doors closing slowly behind me with a hollow thud that made me freeze. The silence that followed was so deep it felt like the whole world outside had vanished. I shined my light toward the altar, noticing that the large crucifix hanging above it was missing Christ's figure entirely, leaving only the empty cross. My skin prickled, and I felt an odd sensation, like being watched from the dark corners of the room. I told myself I'd just explore for a while, take some pictures, and get out before anything strange happened. But as I took my first step toward the altar, I heard it again. That same humming, soft and low, but this time unmistakably closer, coming from somewhere deeper inside the church. The humming grew clearer with every step, a slow, almost hypnotic melody that seemed to echo off the walls and come from everywhere at once. I stopped in the middle of the aisle, my flashlight trembling slightly in my hand, and tried to pinpoint its source, but the sound swirled around me like smoke. I thought maybe it was the wind passing through cracks in the building, but there was no breeze, no movement of air at all. The air felt thick, heavy, as if it didn't want to be disturbed. I called out, my voice low, "Hello? Is anyone here?" But the only answer was the fading echo of my own voice. I scanned the pews again, half expecting someone to sit up from the shadows, but they remained empty, just broken wood and dust. Still, the feeling that I wasn't alone wrapped around me tighter, like invisible hands pressing against my skin. I kept moving forward, my boots crunching over shattered bits of stained glass scattered across the floor until I reached the altar. The closer I got, the more I noticed strange details. A set of candles melted into twisted, waxy shapes, as if burned long after the church was closed. A small wooden box at the base of the altar, its lid carved with a symbol I didn't recognize. Two interlocking circles surrounded by what looked like flames. My instincts screamed at me not to touch it, so I turned away, shining my light toward the side of the church, where a narrow door stood slightly ajar. The humming was louder there, though it seemed to sink into my chest rather than my ears, like a vibration in the air. I reached for the door, hesitating when I noticed faint scratch marks around the handle, as if someone had tried desperately to claw their way out. My throat tightened, but I pushed it open slowly, revealing a narrow staircase spiraling down into darkness. The smell hit me first, a mix of damp stone, mold, and something sickly sweet, like rotting flowers. I aimed my flashlight down the steps and saw the stone walls glistening with moisture, the steps uneven and worn. For a moment I considered turning back. No one would blame me. My friends would probably think I made it far enough just by stepping inside, but something deep inside me, curiosity, stubbornness, maybe arrogance, kept me from leaving. I descended slowly, each step groaning under my weight, the humming now so close, it almost felt like it was coming from inside my own head. The staircase ended in a small arched doorway, beyond which was a low-ceiling room lit only by a sliver of moonlight filtering through a broken grate above. In the center of the room stood an old wooden chair, and on it was a figure. At first, I thought it was a statue, motionless, head bowed. My beam of light landed on it, and the humming stopped abruptly. The silence was so sudden it made my ears ring. Slowly, the figure's head tilted upward, and though the face was hidden by shadow, I could see the glint of two eyes staring directly into mine. For a few seconds I couldn't move, my legs frozen as if those eyes had locked me in place. They were too still, too focused, the kind of gaze that made you feel like every part of you was being examined. My flashlight trembled in my hand, the beam shaking over the figure's shoulders and down its body. It was wrapped in what looked like an old choir robe, the fabric stained yellow and brown, the edges frayed and eaten away by time. The hood was up, casting a deep shadow over its face, but the way the light caught those eyes, they didn't blink, and they reflected the beam in a way that seemed unnatural, almost animal. "Who's there?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended, but the figure said nothing. Instead, it rose from the chair with an unhurried, deliberate movement, the robe swaying slightly as if it were underwater. My mind screamed at me to run back up the stairs, but my body wouldn't listen. The figure took one step forward, and the floorboards under it creaked with a sound that seemed far too loud for such a small movement. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach turn. The figure wasn't walking normally. Each step was slow, dragging, like one leg was heavier than the other, and with every drag, a faint scraping echoed across the room. I backed up instinctively, my shoulders pressing against the cold stone wall, trying to put as much distance as possible between us. My light flickered, dimmed, and then came back, but in that brief moment of darkness, the figure had moved closer, too close. I could now hear its breathing, slow and uneven, a wet sound like air passing through water. "This isn't funny," I muttered, though my voice was shaking. The figure stopped just a few feet away, and for the first time, I could see its mouth beneath the hood. It was moving, but no words came out, just that same humming, now louder, deeper, vibrating in my chest. I realized it wasn't humming a tune anymore. It was holding a single note, as if the sound itself was meant to keep me still. I gripped the flashlight tighter, forcing myself to shine it directly into the hood, and what I saw made me stumble backward into the wall. The face was pale and sunken, the skin stretched thin over sharp bones, and the eyes, they were not human. They were glassy, black, and seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. The mouth widened slightly, the note growing louder until it felt like the air around me was shaking. I shoved myself off the wall and bolted toward the stairs, but the moment I reached the first step, the humming stopped again. The silence was worse than the sound. Then, from behind me, I heard the faint patter of bare feet on stone, moving faster now, closing the distance. I took the stairs two at a time, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly against the damp stone walls, but the sound of those bare feet was right behind me, faster than I thought possible, echoing in a way that made it impossible to know exactly how close they were. My breath came in sharp gasps, the air in the staircase thick and suffocating, and each time my boots hit the next step, I swore I could feel a faint vibration, like something just brushed my ankle. I burst out into the main hall of the church, the sudden open space disorienting after the claustrophobic descent. My light swept across the pews, and for a split second, I thought I saw movement between them, shadows darting where there should be none. The doors were in sight, but they were closed. I didn't remember closing them, and worse, the chains I had broken were no longer on the floor. They were back in place, wound tightly across the handles, the padlock hanging as if it had never been broken. I ran to them anyway, yanking at the metal until my palms ached, but it was useless. They wouldn't budge. My heart pounded in my ears, but then, through that deafening rhythm, came the humming again. It was above me now, drifting down from the upper balcony where the choir once stood. Slowly, I tilted my light upward, and there, leaning over the railing, was the figure. Except it wasn't alone anymore. At least 3 more shapes stood beside it, all in the same decayed robes, their hoods pulled low. They swayed in perfect unison to the sound, their heads tilting from side to side like a pendulum. And though I couldn't see their faces, I knew they were looking straight at me. The air grew colder, and with each breath, I could see a faint cloud of vapor leaving my mouth. Then, without warning, they all stopped swaying, their heads snapping upright at the exact same moment, and the humming ceased. The silence was crushing. I stepped back from the doors, every instinct telling me I was trapped, and as my boot landed on the cracked tile, a deep creak sounded behind me. I turned slowly, my light shaking, and saw that the figure from the basement was now halfway down the aisle, moving toward me with that same dragging, uneven step. But now, every time it dragged its foot, the others on the balcony took a step forward too, in perfect sync, as if they were connected. I stumbled backward toward the altar, desperate for any other exit, and my beam caught on that strange wooden box I had seen earlier. For some reason, my mind screamed that it was important, that maybe it was the key to leaving. Without thinking, I lunged for it, pulling it into my hands, the wood cold and damp, the carved symbol rough under my fingers. The moment I touched it, a low, guttural sound filled the air, not humming this time, but something far more animal and far more angry. The sound vibrated through the walls and floor, making the wooden box in my hands tremble as if whatever was inside was alive and struggling to get out. My grip tightened instinctively, but the moment I held it closer to my chest, the figure in the aisle froze mid-step, its head snapping toward the box with a slow, unnatural tilt, like a predator spotting prey. The 3 shapes on the balcony leaned forward in unison, their hoods shifting just enough for me to see flashes of pale skin and gaping mouths that didn't look human. The guttural noise deepened, rattling in my ribcage, and I could feel an invisible pressure pushing me backward, forcing me closer to the altar. I didn't want to open the box. Every instinct screamed that doing so would be a terrible mistake, but something about the way they were staring at it made me think it was the only thing keeping them from rushing me. My flashlight flickered again, plunging the church into brief intervals of near darkness, and in those moments I could swear the figures moved. 1 second they were far away, the next they were closer, without any sound of footsteps. I stepped back until my legs bumped against the altar, my free hand groping along its surface for anything I could use as a weapon. My fingers brushed over the edge of a rusted candlestick, heavy and cold, and I wrapped my hand around it, lifting it between me and the advancing figure. "Stay back," I warned, my voice breaking, but it didn't stop. Instead, the humming returned, slow, deliberate, and impossibly deep, making my vision blur at the edges. My knees felt weak, my grip on the box slipping, and for a moment I thought I might collapse. Then, from somewhere above, a sudden, sharp crack rang out, like wood splintering under immense pressure. I looked up just in time to see part of the balcony railing break apart, sending one of the hooded figures tumbling toward the ground. But it didn't fall like a person. It twisted in midair, landing silently on all fours like an animal, its head jerking toward me in a twitching, inhuman motion. My breath caught in my throat as it began crawling toward me at an impossible speed, its hands and feet slapping against the tile with wet, rapid smacks. Instinct took over. I swung the candlestick with all my strength, connecting with a sickening thud that made the thing collapse sideways, but not before its hand shot out and clamped around my ankle with icy, bone-crushing force. I stumbled, almost dropping the box, and kicked frantically until its grip loosened. It hissed, not like a person, but like steam escaping under pressure, and scurried back into the shadows near the pews. The others remained still, watching, as if waiting for something. My heart hammered in my chest, and that's when I realized the humming had stopped again, replaced by a faint sound of wood shifting, not from them, but from the box in my hands. The box jerked in my hands as if something inside was pushing against the lid, a slow, stubborn pressure that made the old hinges protest with a thin metallic whine, and for a second I almost dropped it. But I forced my fingers to tighten and pulled the lid open just enough for a wedge of my flashlight to spill into the interior, revealing nothing at first but folded cloth as yellow as old teeth and spotted with dark stains that looked like time itself had tried to eat it. The wood smelled, sharp and bitter, like incense that had burned too long. I slid the cloth aside with the edge of the candlestick and found a small bell no bigger than my palm, cast in dull bronze and cracked along one side, engraved with the same symbol I had seen on the lid, two interlocking circles surrounded by flames. There was also a strip of paper pressed flat to the bottom, so brittle that it almost turned to dust when I touched it, with a few words in smudged Portuguese written in a careful hand. Tocar uma vez para silenciar, não repetir, não dois. My chest tightened as if a belt had been pulled around it. Ring once to silence, I whispered, translating out loud. Do not repeat, not twice. Above me, the three hooded shapes on the balcony leaned farther over the rail, as if the bell had pulled an invisible thread tied to their necks, and the one in the aisle stopped dead, head cocked so sharply that its hood slipped, showing a slice of grey cheek and a mouth too wide for a human face. The humming dropped to a lower note that made my teeth ache. I felt like an animal that had accidentally stepped into a trap and now held the pin that could close it on my own leg or snap it shut on the thing stalking me. I wrapped my fingers around the tiny bell, and it was cold enough to burn. Stay back, I said again. But the figure in the aisle took one dragging step and then another, and my instincts made the decision for me. I lifted the bell, drew in a breath that froze halfway down my throat, and rang it once. The sound was soft, almost polite, a single clear note that did not match the size of the bell at all. It spread through the church like ripples on water, touching walls and pews and windows and finding every crack. And when it reached the figures, they stopped moving as if their strings had been cut. The humming died in an instant, leaving a silence so absolute that I could hear dust settling. Somewhere to my left, the chains on the doors shivered and dropped half an inch, as if the metal had sighed in its sleep. For 3 long heartbeats, I did not move. The figure in the aisle stood frozen, one hand raised mid-step, bent fingers like claws. Face turned toward me, but lifeless like a mask. A sudden, stupid rush of hope pulled at me. Maybe that was it. Maybe the bell was the key and the words were true and I could walk out. I took a step, and my boot scraped the tile. The sound echoed up to the balcony, where the other shapes remained locked in place, and something inside me loosened just enough to make room for a trembling laugh. I reached for the chains to pull them aside, and the bell, slick with sweat and dust, slipped a fraction in my grip. Without thinking, I tightened my hand, and it rang again. It was only a twitch, an accidental flick, a second note that was almost the same as the first but not quite, higher and thinner, and the instant it left the metal I knew I had made a mistake. The air changed. The cold did not deepen like before. It shifted, turning wet and warm, like breath against the back of my neck. The locked figures did not move, but something else did. The floor under the aisle gave a low, hollow thud, as if something on the other side had knocked back. The empty cross over the altar creaked in its brackets and turned by itself a few degrees, the way a weather vane catches a new wind. From behind the altar, deep within the wall, came a soft sound, like 1,000 pages turning at once. The balcony figures bent at the waist, not to attack, not to lean forward, but to bow. All three of them bowing to the altar as if to a person who had just entered the room, and the one in the aisle lowered its raised hand to its chest and sank to its knees so fast its bones should have shattered. My mouth went dry. The bell felt heavier with every second, as if the second chime had filled it with water. A smell rose up from the cracks in the floor, not the damp mold of the basement and not incense. Salt, and something faintly sweet, like flowers that had been left too long in a closed room. The organ pipes, silent all night, released a breath, a thin sigh of stale air that moved the cobwebs and made them draw lines like maps. I told myself to stop, to put the bell back in the box, to set the box down and step away. But my hands did not feel like mine anymore. The strip of paper at the bottom of the box fluttered slightly in a wind that did not exist, and a new line of writing bled into view where I had not seen it before, letters swelling out of the fibers as if ink had waited 50 years to surface. "Se doit abrirà. If to, it will open." Something clicked under the altar. A clean, mechanical sound that did not belong to wood or stone or age. The cracked tiles between me and the first row of pews split along a hairline seam I had not noticed, and a thin black line traced a rectangle on the floor. The hooded things did not look at me anymore. They looked at the rectangle, heads tilted in a curious, almost fearful way. The figure nearest me pressed its face to the floor and began to whisper in a language I did not know, the words sticking together like wet seeds. I backed up until my calves hit the first step of the altar and nearly fell, and somewhere far away I realized the chains on the doors were rattling again, only now they were pulling tighter. The rectangle lifted a fraction, just enough to break the seal of dust around it. The sound that came out was not a hiss of air. It was a single, almost human breath, tired and patient, as if the person who had taken it had been waiting a very long time to exhale. The bell suddenly burned in my palm, so hot I had to toss it to the top of the altar. It landed on the cloth with a dull thunk and did not roll, as if the wood had a grip of its own. My eyes snapped to the crack in the floor as it widened 1 inch, then 2, and a small dark thing slid toward the opening from beneath the pews, bumping along the tile. A rosary, beads the color of old coffee, dragging a cross that was missing the top arm. It fell into the crack and vanished as if pulled by a magnet. The organ released another breath. Outside, far beyond the walls, a stray dog barked once and then went silent with a yelp that cut off too cleanly. I wanted to scream for my friends, for Paolo, for anyone, but my voice seemed to be waiting for permission from something that had just entered the conversation. The paper in the box finished its sentence, letters darkening until I could not pretend I had misread them. "Se dois tocar, a cella abre o canto sai, e o guardião não basta." If rung twice, the cell opens, the song leaves, and the guardian is not enough. On the balcony, the three figures straightened slowly and took one synchronized step back from the rail, like servants making room for a king to pass. The figure beside me crawled backward on hands and knees, never turning its face from the rectangle in the floor. The line reached the last corner and stopped. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then something under the slab pushed up from below, not hard, not violent, but with the confidence of someone who knew the door would yield. The whole church seemed to tilt, and a narrow gap opened, blacker than the night itself. A fingertip, not flesh, not bone, but something shaped like both and neither, touched the light that spilled from my flashlight and cast no shadow at all. I stood there, with my back against the altar, the useless candlestick slick in my fist, realizing with slow horror that the hooded things had never been the threat. They had been the lock, and I had just turned the key. The fingertip lingered in the beam like it was tasting the light, moving in slow, deliberate circles, and though it had no nails, no clear texture, I swore I could see it ripple, like the surface of black water disturbed by a stone. My breath came shallow, and each inhale burned in my throat, but I couldn't pull my eyes away. The hooded figures on the balcony had gone utterly still, their heads slightly bowed, while the one near the aisle lay flat against the floor, in a pose that felt almost like surrender. The gap in the floor widened with a sound like stone grinding against bone, and a second hand emerged, gripping the edge with too many joints, each finger bending twice where it should have bent once. As it pulled, the slab rose higher, revealing not stairs or a chamber beneath, but a void, an impossible depth that swallowed the beam of my flashlight before it could find the bottom. From that depth came a sound so faint I almost missed it, a low, slow exhale that wasn't like the one before. This one was wet, thick, as if it were passing over vocal cords that hadn't been used in centuries. The smell that followed was suffocating, a mixture of salt, decay, and something sweet and chemical, like flowers rotting in formaldehyde. I took a step back toward the altar, but the space behind me seemed to shrink, the shadows stretching like hands that wanted to keep me there. Then, without warning, the fingers released the edge and slipped back into the darkness. The slab didn't fall shut, it stayed half open, and in the silence that followed, a shape began to rise. At first, it was nothing but a column of shadow, formless and smooth, but as it reached the height of the pews, it bent forward, and I saw the faint outline of a head. No face, no features, just the suggestion of one, as if my brain was trying to fill in something that wasn't there. My skin prickled all over. The hooded figure by the aisle began to hum again, this time in short, trembling notes that felt less like a song and more like a prayer. The thing in the gap leaned toward the sound, and for a second I thought it would stop rising. But instead, it extended again, impossibly tall now, its head almost level with the balcony. The three above stepped back farther, pressing themselves against the wall as if to give it more space. Then I realized the humming wasn't just coming from the figure on the ground, it was coming from all of them. And now, from below the floor too. The harmony was wrong, fractured, like notes from different songs forced together, and it made my teeth ache. I tried to inch sideways toward the side door near the altar, my only other chance of escape. But the moment my foot touched the first step leading to it, the humming stopped. The shape turned, not quickly, not in a way that felt aggressive, but it turned, and though it had no eyes, I knew it was looking directly at me. A strange pressure filled my ears, like I had just gone underwater, and the air in my lungs felt thick, resisting every breath. Behind me, the wooden box on the altar rattled once, sharply, as if whatever force had been inside it wanted my attention again. The crack in the floor pulsed faintly with light, not bright but deep, like the glow from a coal buried in ash. The thing straightened to its full height, and without moving closer, it seemed suddenly nearer, as though the space between us had been folded in half. My heart slammed so hard I thought I might faint, but something inside me whispered, no, not my own thought, not my own voice. Ring it again. The words didn't feel like temptation or warning. They felt like instruction, final and absolute, as if every second I delayed was another second I risked something far worse stepping through that gap. The voice, or whatever it was, echoed in my skull, ring it again, so clear it felt closer than my own heartbeat, and my gaze darted to the bell on the altar, sitting perfectly still atop the faded cloth, as if it had never moved, yet humming faintly in a pitch too high for normal ears. My instinct screamed to run, but the church seemed to close in on me, the side door now impossibly far away, the chained front doors blending into the walls like they had never been there at all. The figure in the aisle, still face down, began tapping its fingers against the stone in a slow rhythm, and the three on the balcony mirrored the motion against the wood of the railing, their movements so synchronized it was like they were one body spread across four forms. The shape rising from the gap tilted its head toward the sound, and for the first time I felt movement in the air, not a draft, but a push, a pressure coming from it, reaching me like a tide that wanted to pull me forward. My hand moved without permission, inching toward the bell. The moment my fingers touched the cold bronze, the humming from the figures ceased. And in that silence, I realized the shape wasn't just looking at me. It was waiting for me to decide. The crack widened another inch, and I caught a glimpse of something shifting deep inside. A mass of tendrils, each as thin as hair, writhing and knotting together into shapes my eyes couldn't quite understand. Sometimes looking like hands, sometimes like faces, pressing out from beneath the surface. A drop of something black fell from the edge of the slab and hit the tile with a hiss, leaving a small burn mark. The hooded figure closest to me suddenly raised its head, and for the first time I saw its face in full. The skin was grey and waxy, eyes completely white, and its mouth opened impossibly wide, stretching into a smile that wasn't human. From that open mouth came a whisper so faint I almost thought it was inside my head. "If you don't, it will." My fingers tightened around the bell. I remembered the note on the paper. Ring once to silence, not twice. The third ring wasn't mentioned. There was no warning for it. My heart slammed against my ribs as I realized maybe the only way to send it back, to close the gap, was to take the risk no one had dared to write down. Behind me, the organ let out another wheezing sigh, this time carrying a few random notes that almost formed a melody before cutting off sharply. The thing from the gap leaned forward, bending without any visible joints, and I could feel its presence pressing against me like an invisible wall. My breath caught, my vision narrowed, and the voice returned. Not a whisper now, but a command that shook my bones. "Ring it." The bell felt heavier than before, almost as if it knew what was about to happen, its cold surface sending a sharp ache through my fingers as I raised it. Every instinct told me not to, that the paper's warning had left the third ring unwritten for a reason. But the pressure in the room was suffocating, like the air was being sucked toward the gap in the floor and dragging my lungs with it. The hooded figures all lifted their heads now, their pale faces fully visible, and for the first time, they weren't watching the thing from below. They were staring at me. Their mouths moved in perfect unison, forming words I couldn't understand, and though no sound left their lips, I could feel the vibrations of their speech in my chest. The shape in the gap leaned closer, its head level with mine, even from across the aisle, and I saw the faint outline of a grin forming where its featureless face had been. Something in me snapped. I brought the bell up and struck it with a sharp, deliberate motion. The third chime rang out, louder than the first two combined, a piercing tone that seemed to slice through the air like glass breaking. The sound didn't just echo, it expanded, filling every inch of the church and forcing the shadows to shiver and recoil like living things. The hooded figures screamed without opening their mouths, their bodies arching backward as if the sound was tearing them apart from the inside. The slab over the gap slammed shut so violently the dust exploded upward in a choking cloud, but just before it sealed, something black and thin shot out and wrapped around my ankle. It was cold and impossibly strong, and in a heartbeat it began pulling me toward the crack that was already shrinking. I dropped the bell and slammed the candlestick down onto the thing's grip, but it didn't loosen. It only pulled harder, dragging me across the floor until my hands clawed at the rough tiles. The hooded figure closest to me lurched forward, grabbing my wrists with a grip like iron, and for a moment I thought it was helping me, but then it leaned close, its breath like ice in my ear, and whispered, "You brought it here. You finish it." The chain on the front doors rattled violently, the padlock snapping open and falling to the ground on its own, as if something wanted me out. Now. With one last, desperate swing, I smashed the candlestick down again on the black tendril, and this time it snapped, recoiling back into the gap with a shriek so high-pitched it made my vision blur. The slab sealed completely, the church trembling as if the building itself was holding its breath. My chest heaved, every muscle trembling, but I didn't wait to see what came next. I ran, sprinting down the aisle toward the now open doors, the echo of the bell still ringing in my head, even though I hadn't touched it again. I burst through the doors into the humid night air of Recife, stumbling down the cracked stone steps as if the darkness inside were still clutching at my back. The street was empty. No sign of Paulo, no sign of any of my friends, no sound but my own ragged breathing and the distant lapping of water from the canal. I didn't stop running until I reached the square a block away, where the dim glow of an old street lamp flickered like it was struggling to stay alive. I leaned against it, gasping, my ears straining for any hint that something had followed me, but all I heard was the pounding of my own heart. When I finally dared to look back, the church stood in perfect stillness, the chains somehow back in place across the doors, the padlock hanging intact as though it had never been broken. My first thought was to call someone, to tell them what had happened, but my phone was gone. My pockets were empty, except for the strip of paper from the box, folded neatly, as if it had been placed there after I'd left. My hands shook as I unfolded it, and the words were different now. You did not finish it. I froze, my mouth dry, and the street lamp above me buzzed loudly before going out, plunging the square into near total darkness. From the direction of the church came a sound so faint I almost convinced myself I imagined it. The soft, clear chime of the bell, ringing once and then again. The third ring never came, but the silence that followed felt deliberate, like a breath being held just out of sight. I backed away slowly, never turning my eyes from the church, until I was around the corner, where the shadows of the old buildings swallowed it from view. Even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me. Not running, not chasing, but simply walking at the same pace, just far enough back that I'd never see it unless it wanted me to. That night, I didn't go home. I stayed in a cheap hostel by the river, too afraid to sleep, the paper clutched in my hand like it might protect me. By dawn, the words had faded completely, leaving the strip blank. I told myself I'd never go back to that street, never look for that church again. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the faint hum of a voice in the dark, and every time, it's getting a little bit closer.